The coin hit the bar with a sharp, ringing crack, and every man in the Silver Spur saloon turned to look at the woman who had just slid it back across the counter toward Gilbert Graves. Gilbert stared at the coin. It was his coin. He had dropped it deliberately into her apron pocket not 10 minutes ago, the way he had learned to do in every saloon town between Abilene and the Mexican border. A little extra something slipped to the serving girl, a signal that he was interested, a wordless transaction that usually resulted in a smile and a later invitation. He had done it dozens of times. Not once had any woman ever given it back. He looked up from the coin to the woman standing across the bar. She was not remarkable in the way that saloon women were supposed to be remarkable. She did not wear feathers in her hair or a dress cut low enough to make a preacher faint. Her dress was a plain dark green cotton, worn at the cuffs but pressed clean. Her dark hair was pinned back with a practicality that suggested she had other things on her mind besides looking decorative. Her eyes were the color of creek water in the late afternoon, somewhere between brown and green, catching the amber lamplight in a way that made it hard to look away from her. She was not smiling. "I believe that belongs to you," she said. Her voice was steady, not unkind, but steady in a way that told him she was not afraid of him and was not going to pretend otherwise. Gilbert Graves was 28 years old. He had ridden cattle trails for 7 years, had spent 3 of those years as a hired gun for a land company whose methods he had eventually found too ugly to stomach, and had been drifting since, picking up work where he could, spending money where he felt like it, owing nothing to nobody. He was not accustomed to being unsettled by a woman returning a coin. He was unsettled. He picked up the coin. He turned it over in his fingers once, twice. Then he looked back at her. "Most women keep it," he said. He was not bragging. It was just a statement of fact, offered neutrally, the way you might observe that the sky was clear or the trail was dry. "I'm not most women," she said, and moved down the bar to fill another man's glass. That was it. That was the whole exchange. She did not look back at him. She did not give him the pleasure of a dramatic exit or a lingering glance. She simply went about her work as if he were no more interesting than the sawdust on the floor. Gilbert sat with his whiskey for a long time after that, turning the coin over and over in his palm, watching her from across the room without letting himself be obvious about it. Her name he eventually learned from the barman, a round, sweating man named Pete who was clearly fond of her in the harmless way that older men sometimes were of women they respected, was Frances Morgan. She had been working at the Silver Spur for 4 months. She had come up from the south, Pete said, though he did not know from exactly where. She was a good worker. She did not take trouble and she did not make it. That was all Pete knew, or all he was willing to say. Gilbert finished his whiskey. He ordered another. He watched Frances Morgan move through the room with the calm efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to navigate a saloon full of cowboys and cattlemen without surrendering a single inch of herself to any of them. She refilled glasses. She deflected wandering hands with a quiet word and a look that apparently said everything necessary. She laughed once, briefly, at something an old man at the corner table said, and the sound of it genuine, unguarded, surprised out of her stayed with Gilbert longer than he expected. He left the saloon at midnight and stood outside in the thin Kansas air under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost loud. The town of Harlow, Kansas, in the summer of 1878 was not much more than a main street, a livestock pen, a church, 2 general stores, and a collection of establishments like the Silver Spur that catered to men with money and time, and a desire to spend both. The cattle drives that pushed north along the Kishom Trail had made these small towns briefly prosperous and permanently rowdy, and Harlow was no different from a dozen others he had passed through. He should ride on in the morning. There was nothing here for him. There was a man in Dodge City who had offered him work as a deputy, and Gilbert had been considering it, turning the idea over the way he turned coins over, examining it from different angles, not yet ready to commit. He rode on in the morning. He got as far as the edge of town, where the road turned north and the last of the buildings fell away into open prairie, where the grass went on forever under the enormous Kansas sky, where the wind came straight and clean and indifferent from the north. He stopped his horse. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the open road, and then he turned the horse around and rode back into Harlow. He told himself it was because he had not eaten breakfast. He told himself it was because he wanted to ask Pete about water sources along the North Road. He told himself a great many things that he did not believe even as he was telling them, and he rode back to the Silver Spur and hitched his horse outside and walked in. It was early morning. The saloon was quiet. A couple of men were sleeping at the tables. The swamper was pushing a mop across the floor with the melancholy effort of a man who knew the mess would only come back. Frances Morgan was behind the bar, stocking shelves, her back to the door. She heard him come in because she turned, and when she saw it was him, something moved across her face. Not pleasure exactly, not displeasure either. Something more like recognition, which surprised him because they had exchanged perhaps 15 words. "You came back," she said. "I did," he said. "Why?" He stood there in the doorway with the morning light at his back and the coin in his pocket and no good answer to give her, and after a moment he simply said, "I don't rightly know. I'd like to find out if you're willing." She studied him for a moment with those creekwater eyes. Then she said, "Sit down, then. I'll make coffee." That was how it began. The coffee was strong and black, and she made it in a dented tin pot over a small cast-iron stove at the back of the bar. She brought 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one, set his down in front of him, and sat across the bar with her own, and for a while they did not talk much. Gilbert had never been a man who filled silence with noise for the sake of it, and he discovered with some relief that neither was she. "What's your business in Harlow?" she asked eventually. "Passing through," he said. "Or I was." "Where were you headed?" "Dodge City. A man there offered me work." "What kind of work?" He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Deputy work." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "You a lawman?" "Not yet. I've been a cowhand, a scout, and some other things I'm less proud of." He said it plainly because he had found that honesty offered early and without drama saved considerable trouble later. She seemed to appreciate that. She looked at him over the rim of her cup and said, "How long do you plan to stay in Harlow?" "That," he said, "depends somewhat on you." "Does it?" she said. It was not a question. "You gave me back my coin," he said. "I've been trying to understand why." "Because I don't want your coin," she said, "or what it was meant to mean." "What was it meant to mean?" She gave him a look that suggested she found the question faintly ridiculous. "You know what it was meant to mean." "I do," he admitted. "I apologize for it." She seemed surprised by the apology. She turned her cup in her hand slowly. "Most men don't apologize. Most men don't have a woman return their coin and then spend the rest of the night wondering why," he said. Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. "What do you want, Mr. Graves?" he said. "Gilbert Graves. And I'm starting to think what I want is just to talk with you, if that's acceptable." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the town was beginning to wake up, the distant sounds of horses and hammers and morning voices floating through the gaps in the saloon walls. Frances Morgan set her coffee cup down on the bar with a small, decisive click. "I start my shift at noon," she said. "Come back at 10 and you can help me carry supplies from the general store, and I'll talk to you while we walk." He came back at 10. The general store was run by a man named Harold Wicks, who was suspicious of strangers but fond of profit, and so he accepted Gilbert's presence with a minimal amount of hostility and sold Frances her usual order of canned goods, salt pork, flour, and sundry bar supplies without commenting on the fact that she had brought someone to carry them. Gilbert carried the boxes and did not complain, and Frances walked beside him through the morning heat and talked. She was 26 years old. She was from Waco, Texas, where she had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of a fever when she was 17, and a mother who had remarried quickly and poorly. The stepfather had been the kind of man who considered a woman on his property to be a woman under his authority, and Frances had disagreed with this assessment strongly enough to leave at 18, taking nothing but her father's Bible, and whatever money she had managed to save from the sewing work she had been doing for 2 years. She had worked her way north slowly, stopping in various towns, working in boarding houses and later in saloons, because saloon work paid better, and she had long since decided that what other people thought of her was their business and not hers. She had been in Harlow 4 months. She was saving money. She had a plan. "What's the plan?" Gilbert asked. They were standing outside the Silver Spur now, the boxes stacked at their feet, the morning heat pressing down on the street. Frances squinted against the light. "I want land," she said. "My own land. I want to run a small boarding house or maybe a bakery, something that belongs to me and nobody else." He looked at her. "That's a good plan. Most people think it's ambitious for a woman on her own. Most people are wrong about a lot of things," he said. She turned to look at him then, and the Creekwater eyes were direct and searching. "What about you, Gilbert Graves? What do you want? And I mean truly want, not what you've been telling yourself you want while you ride around on that horse looking lost." He blinked. Nobody had ever said anything quite so precisely true to him in his life. He laughed, which surprised both of them. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I used to think I wanted freedom, and then I had it and found out I was mostly just lonely." She nodded slowly. "Lonely is different from free," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm finding that out." He helped her carry the boxes inside, and she went to work, and he sat at the bar and ate a plate of cold cornbread that Pete provided grudgingly, and thought about Frances Morgan and what she had said and what he had said, and how strange it was that 15 words and a returned coin had managed to crack something open in him that 7 years of wide-open prairie had not. He paid for a room at the boarding house across the street. He told himself it was for 3 days. He stayed for 3 weeks. The pattern of those weeks settled into something that felt, to Gilbert's considerable surprise, like home. He helped Pete with the heavy work around the saloon in exchange for meals, because he was not a man who liked to accept hospitality without offering something back. He helped the blacksmith down the street with shoeing work, because he was good with horses, and the blacksmith, a large, good-natured man named Tom Aldridge, had too much work for one man. He helped the widow who ran the boarding house, Mrs. Clara Howell, repair the sagging porch roof, and she paid him with pie and the kind of satisfied maternal approval that he found unexpectedly warming. And every day he talked with Frances. They talked the way people talk when they are discovering that another person's mind is genuinely interesting to them, which is to say they talked about everything and nothing, circling slowly toward the things that mattered. They talked about books, because Frances had her father's love of reading and borrowed books from the schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Addie Collins, who ran the Harlow school in the back room of the Baptist church. They talked about the land, because Gilbert had been across more of it than most people, and could describe it with the specificity of someone who had looked at it with real attention. They talked about the cattle trade and its economics, which Frances understood better than he expected, because she had been listening to cattlemen in saloons for years and had a sharp, unsentimental grasp of how money moved. They talked about harder things too, in time. On the 5th day, he told her about the land company he had worked for. The kind of work that had involved riding out to homesteads, many of them belonging to families who had been settled there legally, some of them belonging to families who had been there far longer than any legal document could account for, and informing them that they needed to move. He had not hurt anyone directly. He had been one step removed from the violence, but he had been a part of it, and he knew it, and the knowing had eventually become something he could not ride away from fast enough. Frances listened without interrupting him. When he was done, she said, "Why did you do it, in the beginning?" "Money," he said, "and I told myself the law was on the company's side, which was sometimes even true. And you stopped because I watched a family with 4 children get put off land they'd worked for 6 years, he said. The father tried to argue, and one of the other men hit him. The children were standing right there. He was quiet for a moment. I gave the family what cash I had on me, and I rode away from the company that same day. You gave a strange family your money, she said. "It wasn't enough," he said. "It's never enough, but it was what I had." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the bar top. Then she said, "My father used to say that a man's character is most visible in what he does when he thinks nobody important is watching." "Nobody was watching," Gilbert said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you that." It was the first thing she said that he recognized as tender, and it struck him somewhere deep in the chest and stayed there. On the 10th day, Tom Aldridge invited both of them to a community supper at the Baptist church, the kind of event that small frontier towns held regularly, because it was one of the few ways people could gather without someone getting drunk and starting a fight. Frances agreed to go, which surprised Gilbert, because he had sensed that she kept herself somewhat separate from the town's social life, not unfriendly but not invested. "Why are you going?" he asked, walking beside her toward the church in the pale evening light. "Because you asked me," she said simply, and then looked straight ahead as if she had not just said something that made his heart turn over like a new-woken engine. The supper was the long table kind, with food brought by every family in town, and laid out in a magnificent, incoherent abundance: cornbread and beans, and roasted chickens and pies of every variety, and a great tureen of something that smelled like it had been cooking since the previous Tuesday. They sat together and ate and talked with Tom Aldridge and his wife Mabel, who was a pleasant, round-cheeked woman with strong opinions about pie crust and an open curiosity about Gilbert that she expressed without any pretense of subtlety. "Are you planning to stay in Harlow?" Mabel asked him, passing the cornbread. "I'm considering it," he said. Mabel looked from him to Frances with the focused attention of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Well," she said, "it's a good town, quiet mostly. We had some trouble last spring." "What kind of trouble?" Gilbert asked. Tom Aldridge's genial face went slightly heavier. "There's a man named Corbin Dale who runs cattle along the southern range. He's been pushing his operation north, which means pushing other people's fences down. He's had words with several of the smaller ranchers. Last spring, one of those ranchers, a man named Ezra Webb, found his water source redirected, lost half his herd." "Anyone do anything about it?" Gilbert asked. "Ruff Holt wrote some letters," Tom said. "Dale wrote some letters back. Nothing came of it," Frances said quietly. "Ezra Webb's wife takes in mending. She has 3 children. Last winter I gave her my extra blankets." There was a small, specific sadness in her voice that told Gilbert she had known what it felt like to be a woman with children and not enough, even if she herself had no children. She had known it at one remove, the way you know certain griefs by watching them happen to people nearby. He put his hand over hers on the table. It was not planned. He did not think about it before doing it. His hand simply moved, the way hands sometimes move ahead of the thinking part of the mind, and covered hers. She did not pull away. She looked down at his hand over hers, and then she looked up at him, and whatever she found in his face apparently satisfied some question she had been carrying, because she turned her hand beneath his and let her fingers close loosely around his palm, and they sat like that through the rest of the supper, while Mabel Aldridge watched them with a smile she tried and failed to keep from being enormous. On the 15th day, the trouble with Corbin Dale arrived in Harlow wearing boots and a proprietary expression. Dale himself did not come. He sent 3 men, the kind of men who were described in polite terms as cowhands and in more accurate terms as hired pressure. They came into the Silver Spur at midday, and they drank slowly, and they watched Frances with the particular, deliberate attention that was designed to make a woman feel seen in the worst possible way. Gilbert was there, sitting at his usual end of the bar, nursing a coffee and reading a week-old newspaper that Pete had acquired from somewhere. He noticed them when they came in. He noticed the way Frances's shoulders changed, a barely visible stiffening when she recognized something in them. He folded the newspaper. One of the men, a broad-faced man with a red beard who seemed to be the one in charge, leaned on the bar and said to Frances, "You're the woman who gave Millie Webb those blankets last winter." Frances set down the glass she was polishing and looked at him without expression. "I've given blankets to several people. It was a cold winter." Mr. Dale heard about it, the man said. He wants you to know he doesn't appreciate outsiders getting involved in local matters. Mr. Dale, Francis said calmly, can think whatever he likes about what I do with my own property. The man leaned a little further over the bar. Mr. Dale has a way of making things difficult for people who don't see things his way. Gilbert set the newspaper down on the bar. He did it quietly. He stood up from the stool, also quietly, with the measured, unhurried quality of a man who was not afraid of what happened next. "The lady's given you her answer," he said. The red-bearded man looked at him. His two companions looked at him. There was a moment of the particular tension that existed in frontier spaces when men were deciding how far they were willing to take something. "Who are you?" the man asked. "Nobody in particular," Gilbert said pleasantly. "Just a man having his coffee." The moment stretched. Gilbert stood easy, his hands loose at his sides, his face entirely calm, and something in his ease, which was not the ease of a man who was comfortable in these situations, but the ease of a man who had been in enough of them to have arrived at a deeper kind of stillness, apparently communicated something persuasive, because the red-bearded man leaned back from the bar. "Tell your friends in this town," he said, to the room at large rather than to anyone specifically, "that Mr. Dale is a patient man." "But he's not a patient man forever." They left. The tension in the room slowly dissolved. Frances picked up the glass she had been polishing and resumed polishing it, and her hands were entirely steady. When Gilbert sat back down, she said, without looking up, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "You might have made things worse." "I might have," he agreed. "I thought it was worth the risk." She finally looked up at him. Her eyes were very direct. "Why?" He held her gaze. "You know why, Frances." The sound of her given name in his mouth seemed to catch her slightly off guard, even though he had been using it for days. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said softly, "Yes, I suppose I do." That evening she let him walk her back to the small room she rented above the milliner's shop, 2 doors down from the Silver Spur. They walked slowly, not because the distance warranted it, but because neither of them wanted to arrive. The summer night was enormous and close and smelled of dust and dried grass and the distant sweetness of someone's supper fire. The stars were out in their full abundance. Outside her door, she turned to face him. The lamplight from the milliner's window touched her face from one side, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with ornamentation and everything to do with the particular quality of a person who had looked at a hard world honestly and had not let it make them hard in return. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been very careful not to want things I cannot have," she said. "It's a habit I developed early and I'm good at it, but I find that I am having difficulty applying it to you." He felt the words settle over him like something warm. "I'm glad to hear it," he said quietly, "because I find I am having a similar difficulty." She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached up and put her hand briefly against his jaw, the lightest possible touch, and said good night, and went inside and left him standing in the street with the stars overhead and something in his chest that felt like the first clean breath after a very long time of breathing dust. He did not sleep much that night. He lay on the narrow boarding-house bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about land and bakeries, and a woman with creekwater eyes who gave her blankets to struggling families and gave back coins that were meant to diminish her, and faced down hired men without flinching. He thought about what it meant to be lonely when you had chosen freedom and had found the two things were not the same thing. He thought about the plan he had been turning over in the back of his mind for 3 years and never quite allowed himself to commit to: a small piece of land, a proper place to put down roots, a life that was his own in a way that drifting had never managed to be. He had some money saved. Not a great deal, but some. He had been careful with it. On the 16th day, he went to see the land agent. The land agent's office was a small wooden room attached to the general store, run by a man named George Prout, who was the kind of administrator that frontier territories produced in some numbers. Neither corrupt nor particularly honest, simply bureaucratic in the way that comes naturally to men who deal in paper and boundaries. Prout had maps. He had survey records. He had a general awareness of what land was available in the region and what it would cost. Gilbert spent an hour with Prout's maps, asking questions. There was land available along the eastern fork of the creek that ran behind Harlow, good land, well-watered, enough space for a modest operation. The previous claimant had abandoned it 2 years ago and the title had reverted to the territory. He did not buy it that day. He went and found Frances. He found her at the school, of all places, sitting with Miss Addie Collins, the young schoolteacher, talking about a proposed lending library that Miss Collins wanted to establish. Frances had offered to help organize and catalog the donated books, and she was there with a notebook and a pencil, making lists in her precise, angular handwriting. Miss Collins, who was 23 and enthusiastic about everything that could be improved through organization and education, greeted Gilbert with the open friendliness of someone who had heard good things about him from Mabel Aldridge and considered that sufficient recommendation. Gilbert sat down and waited while Frances finished her notes, and then they walked outside together and he told her what he had been looking at. 80 acres on the East Creek Fork, he said. The soil is good. The water is reliable. There's a structure already on it, not much, but something to build from. She stopped walking. She turned to look at him with an expression that was careful and still. Why are you telling me this? He stopped too, facing her in the dry afternoon light. Because I am thinking about buying it, he said, and I wanted to ask what you thought about it. Why does my opinion matter about your land purchase? He took a breath. He was a man who was generally better with actions than words, but he had been working on this particular speech in his head since approximately 2 in the morning, and he thought he had it right. Because if I buy that land, I'd be buying it with the idea that it might be a place worth coming back to, permanently. And I find that the only version of permanently I can imagine wanting involves you being nearby, or more than nearby. He paused. I'm not asking anything of you right now, Frances. I'm just telling you where my thinking is because you seem to me like a person who deserves to know what's being thought. She was very still. The afternoon light was making dust motes visible in the air between them, golden and slow. You've known me 16 days, she said. I know, he said. I also know I have never in 28 years turned a horse around and ridden back to town because of a woman. I did it for you without being able to explain why, and I've been finding explanations every day since. She was quiet for a long time. A cart went by on the main street. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The world continued its business around the small, suspended space they occupied. Then she said, "The land by the East Creek Fork, is there enough room for a bakery?" He felt something warm and enormous rise in his chest. "Frances," he said, "there is room for whatever you want to put there." She nodded slowly as if settling something with herself. Then she said, "I have $62 saved." "I have 112, he said. "That might be enough to start," she said. "It might be," he said. They looked at each other across the golden afternoon air, and then Frances Morgan smiled at him. Not the almost smile he had been seeing, the one that lived at the corner of her mouth, but a full, open, genuine smile that went all the way to the Creekwater eyes and changed her whole face, and Gilbert Graves felt the last of the drifting go out of him like air from a held breath. They went to see Prout the next morning. The land cost $80 between them, which left them with a combined total that was not comfortable but was workable. They signed the papers with Prout watching, and then they went out and stood in the street with the deed between them, Frances holding one corner and Gilbert holding the other, and looked at it. "We are not married," Frances said. "Not yet," Gilbert said. She looked at him. That was very confident. "I believe in being direct," he said. She looked back at the deed. "We are business partners for now," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "Perfectly clear," he said. "I don't want anyone thinking, Frances," he said gently. "I know what you're protecting. I intend to honor it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she folded her half of the deed neatly along the crease and put it in her pocket. "Then we have work to do," she said. The work was considerable. The structure on the East Creek property was a one-room soddy that had been lived in hard and abandoned without ceremony, its single window glass cracked, its door hanging wrong on a broken hinge. The land around it was overgrown but fundamentally good, the soil dark and loose near the creek bank, the grass thick and tall, the cottonwood trees along the water providing shade enough to make the summer manageable. There was a well, hand-dug, that still held clean water. Tom Aldridge came out on the second day and looked at the structure and gave his opinion, which was that it needed a new roof and new window glass and a rebuilt fireplace and a great many other things, but that the walls were solid and the foundation was honest, and that with work it could be made into something worth having. His wife Mabel came too, and stood in the middle of the single room and turned around slowly, and said that, with light from 2 windows and a proper floor, it would be quite cheerful. And Frances looked at her with an expression of such gratitude that Mabel immediately said she would help. The community rallied in the way that frontier communities sometimes did around people they had decided to trust. Pete the barman contributed lumber. Harold Wicks at the general store extended a line of credit that he described as no more than a business arrangement, but which everyone understood as a vote of confidence. Mrs. Howell, the boarding-house widow, appeared one morning with 3 women Gilbert had not met before, who set to clearing the overgrowth with a practiced energy that put him in mind of a natural force. Gilbert worked every day from before sunrise to after sunset. He was not a man who knew how to do things halfway, and he threw himself into the physical labor with a ferocity that was partly about the land and partly about the feeling of building something that was unambiguously worth building. He put up new roof beams with Tom Aldridge. He rebuilt the fireplace with Tom's guidance and considerable help from Tom's son, a quiet 11-year-old named Jack who handed over stones and mortar with the seriousness of someone learning an important trade. He sank new posts for a fence along the creek side and strung them with wire he had bought on credit from Harold Wicks. Frances worked beside him as often as her shifts at the Silver Spur allowed, and she was not a woman who stood aside and watched men do physical things while she provided pleasant company. She was strong and steady and competent in the way of someone who had been doing for themselves for years, and she could swing a hammer with enough authority that Gilbert once stopped what he was doing to watch her drive fence posts, and felt a pride in her that he had no business feeling yet and felt anyway. In the evenings, when the light went and the work was done for the day, they sat by the creek and talked. The creek moved quietly over its stones and the cottonwoods breathed in the warm air, and the fireflies came out in the grass along the bank. They talked about the bakery. Frances had a plan for it that was clear and detailed, born of years of practical observation and a sharp mind applied to a specific problem. She knew what equipment she would need and what it would cost. She knew that the nearest thing to a bakery in Harlow was a woman who sold bread out of her kitchen 2 days a week and could not keep up with demand. She knew that the cowboys coming off the trail had money and hungry memories of baked goods and would spend without thinking twice. She also wanted to make it a place where women could gather, not a saloon, not a church, something in between, a place with tables and good coffee and food and a slightly different quality of air than the rest of Harlow offered. "There's no such thing in most of these towns," she said. "No," he agreed. "There isn't." "There should be," she said. "Yes," he said. "There should be." He looked at her profile in the fading light, the careful intelligence of her face, the quality she had of being entirely present in whatever she was thinking about, and he thought that, whatever it was he had felt in the Silver Spur that first night when she put the coin back on the bar, it had not been mere curiosity or attraction, though it had been those things too. It had been recognition, the particular shock of recognizing in another person something that you had been, without knowing it, looking for. He told her that. He said it badly, haltingly, sitting on the creek bank with his boots off and his feet in the cold water, but he said it, and she listened with her knees drawn up and her arms around them and her eyes on the creek. When he finished, she said, "I recognized you too." "When?" he asked. "When you apologized," she said. "For the coin. Most men don't apologize. You didn't have to. You did it because it was right and not because you wanted anything from it. That is a rarer thing than you know. You decided all of that from one sentence." "I decided a lot of things in that saloon," she said. "I had been deciding things about people in saloons for a long time by then. I got fairly good at it." He looked at her. "What else did you decide about me?" She considered this. "That you were capable of being honest, that you were lonely in a way that was real and not performed, that you were looking for something you hadn't identified yet, and that you were the kind of man who turns around." He was quiet for a moment. "Turns around. When something matters," she said, "you turn around and go back to it instead of riding on." He sat with that. The creek moved past them. The last of the light went out of the sky and the stars began in the west, the way they always began in the west, tentative at first and then flooding in, more and more of them until the sky was full and overwhelming. "Francis," he said. "Yes," she said, "I would very much like to kiss you." She turned her head and looked at him, and there was a smile in her voice when she said, "Then stop announcing it." He kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, careful and honest and a little unsteady, the way first kisses are when they are with someone who matters. She kissed him back with the same quality, not surrender but offering, which was different. When they separated, he pressed his forehead briefly against hers and she let him, and neither of them said anything, because some moments do not require language. They worked on the property for another 2 weeks. The structure took shape slowly. The way honest things do, the new roof solid and well-made. The windows replaced with proper glass that Wicks had ordered in from Wichita. The fireplace rebuilt wide enough to accommodate a proper baking oven. The floor leveled and laid with flat creek stones. Francis chose the colors for the painted trim, a deep blue-green that matched almost exactly the color of her eyes in afternoon light, though if you had pointed this out to her, she would have insisted it was simply a practical color that held up well in direct sun. During this time, the trouble with Corbin Dale did not disappear. It moved, the way trouble does when it has been told to be patient, into the background and simmered there. Ezra Webb came to see Gilbert one afternoon while Francis was at her shift, finding him at the property laying creek stones for the walkway. Webb was a thin, weathered man who had the look of someone who had been fighting a slow, losing battle for long enough that fighting had become simply the habitual state of things. He took off his hat and held it and told Gilbert in a level voice about what had happened with the water source and what he believed Dale intended. "He wants the East Creek Fork," Webb said. "Your land, specifically. The creek on your property feeds mine, goes through mine on the way south. He redirects the creek above your property, everything downstream dries up." Gilbert listened carefully. He looked at the land around him, the healthy grass, the good dark soil, the cottonwoods leaning over the water. "He'd need survey changes to do that legally," he said. "He's been having conversations with the county surveyor in Wichita," Webb said. "Buying conversations." Gilbert thought about this. "Have you written to anyone in Wichita? Anyone in Topeka?" "I wrote 3 letters," Webb said. "I got 2 official acknowledgments and 1 letter that said the matter was under review." "What about the other families on the creek?" Webb named 4 families. "All of them dependent on the creek. All of them small operations, none of them with the resources or connections to fight Corbin Dale through legal channels." Gilbert stood up from the stones. He looked at the property, his and Francis's property, already beginning to look like something real and chosen and worth protecting. He thought about a family with 4 children being put off land they had worked, and a man hitting their father and children watching. He thought about the money he had given them that was not enough. "I'll write some letters," he said. "I know a man in Topeka." The man in Topeka was a former employer of Gilbert's, not the land company, a legitimate cattle buyer, a man named Aldous Farrar who had a large operation and significant connections in the territory legislature, and who, Gilbert believed, had enough fundamental decency to respond to a well-written account of what was happening on the East Creek Fork of the Harlow Range. Gilbert wrote the letter that night, sitting at the table in Mrs. Howell's boarding house with a lamp and a pen, and the care of someone who knew that what he wrote needed to be believed. He described the situation plainly. He named names. He described the water source redirection and the threatened families and the bought conversations with the county surveyor. He sent it the next morning on the eastbound stage. He did not tell Frances immediately. He told her a week later, sitting on the half-finished porch of their property, watching the evening come in over the flat Kansas horizon. She was quiet when he finished. Then she said, "Did you discuss this with Ezra Webb before acting on it?" He had not. He said so. "You should have," she said. Not angry but certain. It is his land and his family. He deserved to make the decision about whether to pursue this. He sat with that. She was right. He knew she was right. He had acted on instinct, on the old habit of taking charge of a situation, and in doing so he had moved around the person most directly affected. "You're right," he said. "I'll go to Webb tomorrow and tell him what I did and give him the chance to redirect it if he wants to." She looked at him steadily. "That's the correct response." "I'm not perfect at this," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither am I. We're working on it together." He went to Webb the next morning. Webb listened to everything Gilbert told him, and then he sat quietly for a moment and said that he was grateful Gilbert had written the letter, and that he would not have thought to do so himself, and that he was glad someone had. He shook Gilbert's hand and said he hoped the man in Topeka listened. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Aldous Farrar's office in Topeka. Farrar had made inquiries. The county surveyor in Wichita had been called before a committee to account for certain irregularities in his records. 2 of the survey modifications that would have benefited Corbin Dale's water claim had been flagged for review and suspended pending investigation. Farrar wrote in his characteristic dry directness that Dale would likely find other avenues of pressure, but that this particular one had been, for the moment, closed. Gilbert brought the letter to Webb, who read it in his kitchen with his wife standing at his shoulder, and when he finished he sat down and his wife put her hand over his and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Webb's wife, whose name was Millicent, looked up at Gilbert with eyes that were wet. "Thank you," she said. "Frances gave you blankets," he said. "She started it." He told Frances that evening. She listened to all of it and then she said, "Farrar did a good thing." "He did," Gilbert said. "And Webb and his family are safe for now." "For now," Frances said. "For now is something," he said. "It's not nothing." She leaned against his shoulder. They were sitting on the porch again, which had become their place, the particular location where the day's work was put down and conversation could spread out in whatever direction it needed to go. The sun was going down and the creek was catching the last of the light and turning it into something moving and gold. "I want to do something for the Webbs," she said. "When the bakery is open, I want to give Millicent work if she wants it." "She'd be good at it, I think," he said. "She bakes," Frances said. "She brought a pie to the church supper. It was the best pie I had ever eaten," he smiled. "Then she's your first hire." She turned her head against his shoulder to look up at him. "Our first hire." He looked down at her. "Our," he said. "Our," she confirmed. He pressed his lips to her forehead and she closed her eyes and the creek went on moving and the light went on changing and neither of them moved for a very long time. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday in early September, 6 weeks after he had first walked back into the Silver Spur with no good reason and every real one. He did not do it elaborately. He was not a man who operated in grand gestures. He did it on the nearly finished property, in the afternoon, with the smell of fresh lumber in the air and the sound of the creek behind them, and the building that would be the bakery solid and real and almost complete at their backs. He had the ring from Mrs. Howell, who had given it to him that morning with the quiet, specific gravity of an older woman passing something on. It had been her mother's ring, a small thing with a blue stone that was not a sapphire but looked like one and seemed, she said, to belong to someone with eyes that color. He held it out to Frances and he said, "I am not going to make you a lot of promises that sound fine now and may prove difficult to keep." What I can tell you is that I want to build this life with you, and I want it to be yours as much as it is mine. I want to know what you think about everything, and to tell you the truth about myself even when it is inconvenient. I want you to have the bakery and the land and whatever else you decide you want. And I want to be the man you come home to." Frances looked at the ring in his palm and then at his face, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears exactly, but was close to them. She said, "You are the only person who has ever treated what I want as a serious question." "It is a serious question," he said. "What do you want, Frances?" "You," she said. "You and this land and this bakery and a life I have a say in. That is what I want." "Then say yes," he said. "Yes," she said. And she held out her hand and let him put the ring on it, and then she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him and said, "I love you, Gilbert Graves." The words hit him with the force of something he had been braced for without knowing it. He pulled her to him and held her against his chest and said, against her hair, "I love you." I have been trying to find the right moment to say it, and have decided that the right moment is any moment in which it is true, which is every moment. She laughed against his shirt, the real laugh, the genuine one. "That is the best thing you have ever said." "I have been practicing," he said. They were married 3 weeks later by the Reverend James Ellsworth of the Baptist Church, a tall, solemn man who became unexpectedly moved during the ceremony and had to stop and collect himself twice, which made everyone in the small assembled crowd feel that they were witnessing something real and important, which they were. Tom and Mabel Aldridge were there, and Pete the barman, looking uncomfortable in a collar, and Mrs. Howell, who cried openly and made no apology for it, and Miss Addie Collins, and Ezra and Millicent Webb, and Harold Wicks, and the swamper from the Silver Spur, who had apparently developed a fondness for both of them without anyone noticing. Frances wore her best dress, which was a deep blue-green that matched the trim on the bakery, and she carried a bunch of wildflowers that Mabel had gathered from the creek bank that morning. She walked down the aisle, which was the center of the church, marked with chairs on either side with the unhurried, direct quality that was entirely hers, and when she reached Gilbert and looked at him, he thought he had never in his life been so thoroughly glad to be standing exactly where he was. They spoke their vows clearly and honestly, in the plain language of the frontier, and when Reverend Ellsworth pronounced them married, Gilbert kissed his wife in front of the congregation with the particular care of a man who understood what he had been given. The Silver Spur contributed a barrel of its best whiskey to the celebration, which Pete delivered in person, and then consumed a portion of, dancing with Mrs. Howell in the Baptist church yard, with an enthusiasm that nobody had expected from either of them, and which became the subject of cheerful conversation in Harlow for some weeks afterward. Frances had given her notice at the Silver Spur 2 weeks before the wedding. Pete had looked sad but not surprised, and had paid her a bonus that he called back wages, and she called generosity, and they both knew was the latter. She had used part of it to buy a proper baking oven from a firm in Wichita that made cast-iron stoves, which arrived in 3 sections on the stage and required Gilbert, Tom Aldridge, and 2 other men to assemble inside the bakery, with a great deal of consultation of the instruction sheet and some frank language that Frances pretended not to hear. The bakery opened in October of 1878, on a cool, bright morning with a smell coming from it that reached the main street of Harlow and drew people in the way that the smell of fresh bread has always drawn people, involuntarily, helplessly, following something that is older than reason. Frances had been baking since before sunrise. Millicent Webb was beside her, having accepted the offered work with a composure that made it clear she was absorbing the significance of it privately and carefully. Between them, they had produced 12 loaves of bread, 4 apple pies, 2 dozen biscuits, and a batch of cinnamon rolls whose smell alone caused the man from the surveying office 3 doors down to walk over and stand outside the door looking helpless. Gilbert had made the sign that hung above the door. He was not a particularly skilled carpenter, but he was careful, and he had spent 2 evenings getting the letters right. It read Morgan Bakery, because Francis had chosen the name and Gilbert had not argued. "It should have your name on it," he had said. "It does," she said. "I am Francis Morgan Graves now, but the bakery was built on what Francis Morgan saved and planned, so the bakery gets her name." He had looked at her with the particular quality of admiration he had learned to associate with the moments when she said exactly the right thing about something that mattered. "All right," he said. "Morgan Bakery it is." The first day's business was staggering. By noon they had sold everything. Francis and Millicent stood in the emptied bakery and looked at each other, and Millicent said, with a small, stunned smile, "We are going to need to make more." And Francis said, "We are going to need to make twice as much." And they both started laughing in the way of people who are genuinely overwhelmed and genuinely delighted at the same time. Gilbert came in at noon to find his wife sitting on a flour barrel counting receipts, her apron white with flour up to the elbows, her hair coming out of its pins, and a look of pure, uncomplicated happiness on her face that he had not seen before in exactly this form. Not the happiness of intimacy, which he knew, or the happiness of the land by the creek, which he also knew, but the happiness of a woman who had built something with her own hands and her own vision and found that it was exactly what she had imagined it would be. He leaned in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She looked up and saw him. "We sold out," she said. "I heard," he said. "Half the town has been telling me for the last 2 hours." She held up the receipt total. His eyebrows went up. "You're going to need to hire more people," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the Bowman sisters. They're looking for work." "How many sisters?" "2," she said. "Agnes and Ruth. Agnes is 20 and Ruth is 17. Millicent and 2 sisters," he said. "You'll have quite an operation." "That is the general idea," she said. He crossed the room and sat down across from her and said, "How does it feel?" She looked around the bakery, the blue-green trim, the cast-iron oven still warm, the flour on every surface, the empty shelves that had been full that morning, the tables where women had sat with coffee while their children played near the door. Then she looked at him. "Like mine," she said. "It feels like mine." "It is yours," he said. "Ours," she corrected, gently but firmly. "Ours," he agreed. That winter was the kind of winter that Kansas produced with straightforward severity, long and cold and gray, with wind that came off the open plains without anything to slow it down and found every gap in every wall and let you know about it. But the bakery was warm, and the property on the East Creek Fork was well built, and the two of them settled into the particular pleasure of a life shared by people who have chosen each other with their eyes open. He ran cattle in a modest, sustainable way that asked no more of the land than it could give. She ran the bakery in a way that was already, by December, a small institution in Harlow, a place women came to in the mornings for coffee and quiet and conversation in a setting that was theirs, a thing that had not existed before, and which people now found themselves unable to imagine the town without. Agnes Bowman joined them in November, a cheerful, efficient young woman who turned out to be as gifted with pastry as her older sister Ruth, who joined in December, was gifted with bread. Millicent Webb had a quality with customers, a warm steadiness that made people feel they were welcome, that Francis recognized as rarer and more valuable than technical skill. The four of them made a working team that ran the bakery with a collective competence that Gilbert, watching from a respectful distance, found entirely impressive. He had written to the man in Dodge City about the deputy position and declined it. He had thought about doing it for weeks, and then done it on a morning when Francis was standing at the stove with her back to him, singing something quiet under her breath that he did not recognize, and he had thought that there was nothing in Dodge City or anywhere else that was worth leaving this for. The letter of decline was brief and professional and entirely honest. He had decided to pursue ranching on acquired land in Harlow, and he wished the man well in finding someone suited to the work. He sent it and felt not a shadow of regret. The winter deepened. Christmas came to Harlow with a particular quality. The church decorated with pine boughs that someone had brought from up north. A community gathering at the school that Miss Collins organized with her characteristic thoroughness. A tree in the Aldrich house that Mabel covered with candles and paper decorations, and invited half the town to come and see. Frances made gingerbread in quantities that could have supplied a small army, and distributed it across town without charging for any of it, which Pete the barman described as bad business practice, and which everyone understood as the opposite of bad business, and which made the Morgan Bakery an even more firmly established fixture of Harlow's civic affection. On Christmas Eve, they sat by their fire in the property house, which was no longer the barely habitable structure it had been, and was now a genuinely warm and comfortable home with proper furniture that Gilbert had built through the autumn and proper curtains that Frances had sewed and proper everything, the creakstone floor smoothed with use and gleaming in the firelight. Frances was leaning against him, her feet tucked under her, looking at the fire. He had his arm around her. The creek outside was half frozen and made a different sound in winter than in summer, quieter and more internal. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked down at her. "All right." She turned her head to look at him, and her expression had a quality he had not seen before, a particular combination of joy and uncertainty and the specific solemnity of someone carrying important news. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "When?" "Summer," she said. "June or July, I think." He felt something move through him that was not like any single emotion he had a word for, but was more like all of them arriving at once: joy, certainly, and a deep, almost frightening tenderness, and a fierce desire to protect, and something that was almost like awe at the plain fact of it. He pulled her closer. She let him. She put her hand on his chest and he put his hand over hers, and they sat like that, holding each other carefully, while the fire burned and the half-frozen creek murmured outside in the cold night. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. It was a real question. She was not performing worry, she genuinely wanted to know. "Frances," he said, "I have never been happier about anything in my life except marrying you." She exhaled slowly. He could feel the tension going out of her. He held her more firmly. "I am not frightened," she said, "but I want you to know that I will not be a woman who disappears into motherhood. I want to keep the bakery." "I know you do," he said, "and you will." "It's not certain," she said. "People will say things." "People can say things," he said. "They will do it while eating your bread and drinking your coffee, and you will smile at them and they will go away and you will keep the bakery." She laughed against his shoulder. "You make it sound very simple." "Some things that are complicated to talk about are actually simple to do," he said. She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I've found that to be true." Spring came slowly to Harlow, the way it always did on the Kansas plains, with false starts and backsteps, and the occasional fierce reminder that winter had not entirely released its grip. But by April the creek was running clear and full, and the cottonwoods were coming back into leaf, and the prairie was showing its first green, and Frances was showing, quietly but unmistakably, and the Morgan Bakery was doing well enough that she had been able to purchase the adjacent lot with the intention of expanding. The trouble with Corbin Dale surfaced again in April, in a different form. Dale himself came to Harlow this time, not his men, but Dale personally, which was either a sign of escalation or a sign of negotiation, and Gilbert had learned enough about these situations to know that the distinction between the two was not always visible from the outside. Dale was a large, well-dressed man in his 50s, the kind of cattleman who had been successful for long enough that he had come to believe success was a character trait rather than a circumstance. He walked into the Morgan Bakery on a Tuesday morning while Frances was behind the counter, and Gilbert was in the back room shifting supply crates, and he introduced himself to Frances with a bonhomie that was professional in quality. Frances listened to him politely. He told her, in the pleasant, reasonable voice of a man who expected pleasantness and reasonableness to be sufficient, that he was interested in acquiring the East Creek property. He named a price. The price was fair. He said this himself, a fair price, with the slight emphasis of someone who has decided in advance that the offer is generous. Francis said, "It is not for sale." He offered more. She said again calmly, "It is not for sale." He shifted his approach. He said that it was admirable what she had built, that the bakery was a real asset to the community, that a woman with her capabilities could do well with the money from the land sale, that there was other land available. Francis said, "Mr. Dale, I spent 4 years saving money for land of my own. I have built a bakery on that land and a life on that land, and I have no intention of selling it at any price because I did not buy it to sell it. I bought it to stay." She said this in the steady, unhurried voice that Gilbert knew very well by now, the voice that told you she had decided something, and that the decision was not subject to revision. Gilbert came through from the back room at that point, carrying a crate, and found his wife standing across the counter from Corbin Dale, with her hands flat on the counter and her expression entirely calm. He set the crate down and looked at Dale. Dale looked back at him with the assessing quality of a man recalibrating. "I've explained to Mr. Dale that the property isn't for sale," Francis said without turning around. "She has," Gilbert said. "That covers it completely." Dale looked from Francis to Gilbert and back. He said, "I imagine you'll want to discuss it." "We discussed it before you arrived," Francis said. "It is not for sale." A moment passed. Dale was a man who understood leverage, and he was accustomed to having it. He looked at the bakery, the tables of women with their coffee, the shelves of bread, the smell of something sweet from the oven, the general evidence of an established, successful, deeply rooted enterprise. And whatever he calculated in that moment, he put his hat back on. "I may come back to the conversation," he said. "You are welcome to come back for bread," Francis said pleasantly. "It is very good bread." He left. Millicent Webb, who had been making change at the end of the counter and had heard everything, looked at Francis with wide eyes. Francis picked up a cloth and began wiping down the counter. "Is he going to make trouble?" Millicent asked. "He might try," Francis said. "But he does not own the water anymore legally, and the land is ours and documented. He can make noise. Noise is uncomfortable but not fatal." She went on wiping the counter. Gilbert stood in the doorway between the back room and the bakery and looked at his wife and thought that he had been mistaken, back in the Silver Spur, when he had thought she was not remarkable. He had been thinking of remarkable in the wrong way. He had been thinking of visible, ostentatious things. She was remarkable in the way that certain kinds of strength are remarkable, not loud, not displayed, but entirely present and entirely real, the kind that does not shift under pressure because it was never performing in the first place. He went back to the supply crates. Dale did not come back. He wrote 2 letters to Prout, the land agent, inquiring about the East Creek property. And Prout, who had decided some months ago where his sympathies lay, wrote back informing him that the property was not on the market and that he had no authority to facilitate a sale the owners had not initiated. Dale went looking for another avenue to his water ambitions and found, apparently, enough other difficulties to occupy him. Because by summer the pressure on the Creek families had diminished to a background hum that everyone agreed to keep an eye on but which was no longer an active emergency. Ezra Webb, his water secure for the time being, had a good spring and a better summer, and came to the bakery one morning with 3 jars of honey from hives he kept on his property, and set them on the counter, and told Francis they were a thank you. She made him sit down and eat a cinnamon roll, and told him that things worked out better when people looked after each other, and that the honey was beautiful, and she was going to use it in the baking. He went home looking lighter than he had looked in years. The summer of 1879 came on warm and broad, and full of the particular generosity that good summers had on the Kansas plains, when the grass was thick, and the sky was enormous, and the light had a quality that made everything it touched seem substantial and chosen. The creek ran well, and the cattle on the East Creek property were doing well, and the bakery was doing so well that Francis had begun the expansion into the adjacent lot, which was going to add a proper dining room with 6 additional tables and a window that looked out over the creek. In June, Gilbert Graves became a father. The baby arrived on a warm Saturday morning with the cottonwoods outside the bedroom window bright in the early light. And he was a boy, big-lunged and loud about his opinions from the first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's creek-water eyes. And Frances held him against her chest in the aftermath with the specific, bone-deep exhaustion and joy of a woman who has just done the most difficult and extraordinary thing a person can do, and looked at him with an expression that Gilbert, watching from the chair beside the bed where he had been sitting for the last 12 hours, would carry with him for the rest of his life. "What do we call him?" she asked. They had talked about names. They had made lists and crossed them off and argued pleasantly and come back to several possibilities. But looking at the specific person who had just arrived, Gilbert said, "What does he look like to you?" Frances looked at her son for a long moment. "He looks like someone who is going to have very strong opinions," she said. Gilbert smiled. "He looks like his mother." She gave him the look that told him she was pretending not to be pleased. "Thomas," she said. "For Tom Aldridge, who helped us build the house." "Thomas," Gilbert said. "Thomas Graves." "Thomas William Graves," Frances said. "William was my father's name." "Thomas William Graves," Gilbert said. "That's a good name." Mabel Aldridge, who had been present for the birth along with the town's doctor, a steady, capable man named Dr. Lentz, came in and looked at the baby and immediately began crying in the proud, delighted way that was entirely characteristic of her. And when a fine Tom, who was waiting in the kitchen and who came in and stood over the baby with his large hands held carefully away from his sides, as if afraid of disturbing something precious, and said, in a voice somewhat thicker than usual, that it was a fine boy, a very fine boy. Thomas William Graves was, from the beginning, exactly the person his mother had predicted, a person with very strong opinions. He expressed these opinions freely and loudly, and without any apparent concern for the convenience of the people around him, and his parents addressed this with the patience and occasional desperation of all new parents everywhere, and made their way through the first months on reduced sleep and increased coffee. Frances went back to the bakery when Thomas was 6 weeks old, bringing him with her in a basket that Millicent Webb had made for the purpose. The women of Harlow took to this with a warmth that was both practical and something more. The sight of a woman working with her infant nearby was, in a small frontier town where women were expected to choose between working and mothering, a quiet but specific kind of statement. Nobody said so explicitly, but several women who had been making that choice, or who had been told they had to, looked at Frances Graves at the Morgan bakery counter with something that was not quite hope and not quite resolution, but was somewhere close to both. The bakery expanded in late summer, the dining room finished and opened, and the 6 new tables were full within a week and stayed full. Agnes Bowman had taken over the primary baking alongside Millicent, and Ruth Bowman had proved to have a talent for the business side of things that Frances recognized and put to use, eventually giving Ruth the role of keeping the books, which she did with a precision and care that freed Frances to think about the larger questions of the operation. The larger questions included, by the time Thomas was 4 months old and developing something that looked increasingly like a personality, the question of the education that would be available to him and to other children in Harlow. Miss Collins's school was good for what it was, but it was 1 room and 1 teacher, and the curriculum, though thorough, was limited by resources. Frances began talking with Miss Collins about what it would take to expand. She brought it to Gilbert one evening. Thomas was sleeping in his basket near the fire, making the small, periodic sounds that sleeping infants make, sounds that had, over 4 months, become as natural to both of them as breathing. Frances sat with her coffee and told him what she and Miss Collins had discussed: a 2nd room, a 2nd teacher, a curriculum that extended to older children who currently had no schooling option past the age of 12. "How much?" Gilbert asked. "More than the 2 of us have spare," Frances said, But Mabel Aldridge has been talking to 3 other women about it, and Miss Collins thinks she can write to the Territory Board of Education for partial funding, and if the bakery has another good season I can contribute more significantly next year. What do you need from me? He asked. Your honest opinion, she said, and your support if you have it. You have both, he said. What you are describing is a school that can serve children who currently aren't being served. It seems entirely necessary. There are children of the Mexican families who work some of the ranches, she said. They have no access to the school at all. I know, he said. I've thought about that. He paused. When you talk to the Territory Board, will you address that specifically? She looked at him steadily. That is exactly what I intend to do. It was a harder fight than the bakery had been. The Territory Board of Education sent a letter that was polite and non-committal and cited existing provisions that Francis and Miss Collins both knew were provisions in theory only. They wrote back. They wrote to individual board members. They collected signatures from families in Harlow, not just the Anglo families, but the Mexican families too, names that Francis went and solicited personally, riding out to the ranches with Gilbert, asking in the direct and respectful way she had of asking things that communicated she understood what she was asking and why it mattered. Several of the Mexican families looked at her with a wariness that she understood and did not take personally. One woman, a mother of 4 named Elena Vargas, whose husband worked on the Aldridge Ranch, listened to Francis's explanation of what the school expansion would mean and then said, quietly, My children are not always welcome in the places that say they are welcome. Francis said, I know. I cannot promise you that everything will be easy, but I can tell you that Miss Collins and I intend to build something that means what it says. And that if your children come and are not treated fairly, I want to hear about it from you directly. Elena Vargas looked at her for a long moment. Then she gave her daughter's name for the petition. The petition went to Topeka with 47 signatures, the territory's largest petition for school expansion since the Homestead Act. By the following spring, the funding came through, partial but real, and the school's second room opened in March of 1880 with a second teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Peter Holt, who had no idea what he was walking into and adapted to it with commendable speed. The first class in the second room included 4 children from Mexican families, 3 from black families who had settled on homestead land east of Harlow, and the expected assortment of children from the town's established Anglo households. Miss Collins's opening day speech was short and clear, and said that this school was for every child in the Harlow district and that this would be enforced. Mr. Holt, standing at the back of the room, nodded vigorously. Frances stood in the back of the room with Thomas on her hip, listening to Miss Collins's speech, and felt something warm and specific in her chest that was not pride exactly, but was close to it, the feeling of watching something you believed in take real shape in the world. She looked sideways at Gilbert, who was standing beside her. He was looking at Miss Collins too, his expression attentive and quiet. He felt her looking and turned his head, and they looked at each other for a moment over their son's head, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the school carried on around them. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, with the weight and texture of things lived and not merely endured. Harlow grew slowly and steadily, adding to itself in the way of frontier towns when the land around them is genuinely good new families, new businesses, a doctor's proper office, a second church, a telegraph office that connected the town to the wider world in ways that were sometimes alarming and usually useful. The cattle trade shifted as the railroad came closer, and Gilbert shifted with it, adapting his operation to the changing economics with the practicality of someone who had paid close attention to how the world worked. The Morgan Bakery continued to be the Morgan Bakery. Frances added a small room off the side where women's groups met, sewing circles, reading groups, the school board subcommittee, the petition-writing campaigns that Frances seemed to generate with quiet regularity on behalf of causes she considered both important and achievable. It was not a political salon, exactly. It was something more pragmatic and more specifically useful. A place where women with ideas and energy, and no official channels met and found each other, and occasionally changed small things in the world. Thomas grew with the ungovernable speed of all children, talking early and clearly, with his mother's directness and his father's observant stillness. A combination that made him remarkable from the age of 2 and difficult to argue with from the age of 4. He was in Miss Collins's classroom by 5 and could read by 6 and was, by 7, bringing home library books that he had chosen himself and reading them at the kitchen table with the focused intensity of someone who had found the thing they loved. Gilbert taught him horses. This was not a negotiated decision. It was simply what happened between a father and a son who spent time together on land that required horses to manage, and Thomas took to it with a seriousness that was entirely characteristic of him. By 8 he was competent with a horse in the way that country children were, which was to say with a practical fluency that left no room for sentiment, but was not without affection. Frances watched this from a position of informed approval. She had no objection to her son learning to ride and work the land. She had one specific condition which she stated once and only once. He is also going to learn everything that Miss Collins and Mr. Holt have to teach him, and the horses come after the books. Thomas, 7 years old, considered this seriously and said, "What if I finish the books faster?" Frances looked at him for a moment and then looked at Gilbert, who was carefully not smiling. "Then," she said, "we will find you more books." In the spring of 1882, when Thomas was nearly 3, Frances had a daughter. They named her Clara Louise for Mrs. Howell, who had died in the previous winter peacefully, at 71, in the boarding house she had run for 30 years, with Pete the barman and several of the women from Frances's bakery group in attendance, and with the particular quality of completion that belongs to a life fully and usefully lived. Clara Louise was a different person entirely from her brother, quiet and watchful where he was loud and active, with her father's dark hair and a particular smile that was entirely her own, and which she deployed rarely and deliberately, so that receiving it felt like being specifically chosen. Mabel Aldridge became Clara's devoted godmother, and took this role with a thoroughness that resulted in Clara having opinions about pie crust before she was 2. The household on the East Creek property was, by now, genuinely and solidly itself, not the borrowed temporary thing that boarding house existence had been, not the held-breath hope of the early building days, but a house that knew itself completely, with the specific accumulated character of a home that has been lived in by people who love it. The furniture Gilbert had built in the early years had been supplemented and rearranged and painted. Frances's books, the collection had grown considerably since her father's Bible occupied 2 proper shelves. The kitchen was warm in a particular way that came from years of good cooking. The porch that looked out over the creek had 2 chairs that matched and 2 that did not, and a small table between them that had been there since the first summer. On evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, they sat on that porch, not always talking. Sometimes just present the creek below, the cottonwoods above, the enormous Kansas sky overhead, and the 2 of them settled into each other and into the life they had made with the specific ease of people who have stopped being surprised by their own happiness and have learned instead to be simply grateful for it. In the summer of 1883, something happened that was both unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely logical given what Frances had been quietly building for 5 years. A woman named Helen Marsh came to Harlow on the stage from the north, traveling with a child and very little money, fleeing a situation in Denver that she described to Frances in the back room of the bakery, with a quiet, controlled precision that told Frances she had been telling the story to herself for a long time in order to survive it. The situation was of a kind that was common and commonly ignored. Frances listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "You can stay here for now. We have a room at the back of the bakery that we use for storage but can be made into something better. Agnes will help with your daughter when you need it." Helen Marsh looked at Francis with an expression that had in it equal parts relief and disbelief. "I cannot impose. It is not an imposition," Francis said. "It is an arrangement. You will work here while you are able, and you will save your wages, and when you have enough to go where you want to go, you will go. Or if you want to stay in Harlow, you will stay. Either way, you will make the decision yourself." Helen Marsh worked at the Morgan Bakery for 7 months. She was skilled and reliable, and it turned out, had considerable experience with the business side of a bakery operation from a family enterprise in her past. By the time she left with sufficient money and a letter of character from Francis to a boarding house proprietress in Kansas City who was an acquaintance of Mabel Aldridge's, she had also served as the first evidence of what the back room of the Morgan Bakery became, slowly and without announcement, over the next several years. A stopping point for women who needed one. This was not organized. Francis did not call it anything or establish it as a formal institution. It simply existed, the way useful things exist when someone practical puts them in the right place. There were always people who needed a stopping point. Francis had been one of them once, and she had had no stopping point, and she had managed without one, but she had always known it would have helped. Gilbert's only contribution to the arrangement was to build 3 more proper beds for the back room and never mention what they were for to anyone who didn't already know. This was, Francis told him once, exactly the right contribution. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You're doing exactly the right thing," she said. "Which is making space and being quiet about it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I used to think the most useful thing I could do was fix a problem directly." "Sometimes it is," she said. "And sometimes," he said, "the most useful thing is to make room for someone else to fix it in a way they actually own." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He had been learning, through years of living beside her, how to think about usefulness in this way. He had been learning it slowly and imperfectly and with occasional failures, and she had corrected him when he needed it and praised him when he earned it, and never pretended that either was more than it was. It was, he thought, the most important education he had received in his life. In 1884, Thomas started school in the second room with Mr. Holt, who within 1 week described him to his parents as the most demanding student he had ever taught, and said this in the particular tone of educators who are deeply pleased by a demanding student but maintaining professional composure. Francis smiled. Gilbert asked Mr. Holt what Thomas needed. Mr. Holt produced a list. Gilbert rode to Wichita the following week and came back with the books on the list, and several that Mr. Holt had not thought to list because he had not known they were obtainable. Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the new books and did not look up for 3 hours. Clara Louise, 2 years old, sat across the table from him and watched him read with the focused attention she applied to everything her brother did, as if cataloging it for future reference. "She's going to be something," Gilbert said to Francis, watching from the kitchen doorway. "She already is something," Francis said. The years went on. The town changed, and the land changed, and the cattle trade changed as the railroad finally came within practical range of Harlow, making the long drives up from Texas less necessary, and reshaping the economics of every ranching operation in the region. Gilbert adapted again, as he had before, with the quiet practicality of someone who had always been better at looking honestly at what was than at holding onto what had been. He made a trip to Wichita in the autumn of 1885 to discuss rail shipping terms with an agent there, and on the way back he stopped in the town where, 7 years earlier, he had seen a family put off their homestead land with 4 children watching. He did not know if the family was still in the area. He did not expect to find them, but he stopped at the general store and described them to the storekeeper, and the storekeeper knew who he meant, because in small places people are remembered. The family was on new land 20 miles east. The father had found work building the railroad and had saved enough to purchase a small claim. The children were older. The storekeeper described them with the casual familiarity of someone who sees a family at church and in the store on a regular basis. Gilbert bought a quantity of supplies from the storekeeper and arranged to have them delivered to the family's address, with a note that said only that it was from someone who remembered meeting them once and wished them well. He did not put his name. He rode the rest of the way home in the early winter light, thinking about a long road and a returned coin and a woman who had looked at him with creek-water eyes and given him back something he had not known he had lost. He told Frances about it that evening, and she listened to all of it, and when he finished, she simply held his hand in hers across the kitchen table, her thumb moving slowly over his knuckles, and said, "That was a good thing to do." "It was a small thing," he said. "Small things," she said, "are the ones that add up." In the spring of 1886, there was a third child, another boy, born in March when the Kansas plains were just beginning to remember they were capable of being green. They named him Robert, after Gilbert's father, who had died when Gilbert was young, and whose name he had not been sure he wanted to use until the moment he looked at the new baby, and thought that something in the baby's face looked like a beginning that deserved to carry a remembered name into it. Thomas, now 6, regarded Robert with the proprietary seriousness of an eldest child who has been informed of his responsibilities and has taken the news gravely. Clara Louise, 4, regarded Robert with what appeared to be a considered opinion that he was interesting but not yet sufficiently sophisticated for meaningful interaction, a position she maintained until Robert was old enough to pull her braid, at which point she revised her assessment to include him more fully in her world. Robert grew toward cheerfulness the way some people do, as if happiness were a gravity that had always been pulling him. He had his father's silence in the early morning and his mother's directness when he had something to say, and he was, from the beginning, the one most likely to be found in the kitchen getting flour on himself in the pursuit of baked goods. Frances found this entirely fitting. The Morgan Bakery by 1887 was not just a bakery. It was a small institution. The bakery itself, the dining room, the back room with its quiet function, the subscription-lending library that Frances and Miss Collins had formally organized the previous year, the women's reading group, the twice-weekly meeting of the Harlow Women's Economic Society, which Frances had helped found and which concerned itself with practical matters of credit, property, and employment for women in the district. It was also still, every morning, a place that smelled of bread and coffee and cinnamon, and which drew the people of Harlow in with the simple, irresistible reliability of good things freely made available. Agnes Bowman had married the previous summer, a cattleman named Theodore Park, who was a good man, and who supported Agnes's continuing to run the bakery operations, with a generosity that Agnes described to Frances as rare, and Frances agreed with, and privately attributed, in part, to the fact that Agnes had the kind of clarity about what she needed from a partner that came from working for years alongside a woman who had never compromised on that clarity herself. Ruth Bowman had gone north to Topeka, working in an accountant's office with a firmness of purpose that had resulted, within 2 years, in a significantly reorganized accounts department and a junior partnership, the latter being extraordinary enough for the year that even Ruth, who did not generally boast, mentioned it in her letters to Frances with a slightly elevated energy that told Frances she had never quite gotten over being surprised by how far competence could take you when you refused to apologize for it. Gilbert found, in the autumn of 1887, that he had built exactly the life he had half imagined at 28 without the language to articulate it. The cattle operation on the East Creek property was modest but sound. The house was warm and full of children and books and the specific noise of a life being actively lived. The woman he had married was still, after 9 years, the most interesting person he had ever met, and the quality of her that had first unsettled him. The absolute steadiness of someone who had decided what they were and did not need the world's confirmation to maintain it, had not diminished, but had deepened, like a note played on a good instrument that opens up as it resonates. He told her this on a September evening, sitting on their porch with the creek below them and the cottonwoods in their autumn color, and the sun going down in the west in a spectacular excess of orange and gold. Robert was asleep inside. Thomas and Clara Louise were in the barn, doing something with the horses that was probably within acceptable limits and possibly not, but he had decided to let the evening be and deal with whatever the outcome was later. 9 years, he said. She looked at the sunset. 9 years, she agreed. I want to tell you something, he said. She turned to look at him with the particular attention she had always given him when he said that, the full and unhurried quality of someone who considered his words worth her time. I was not, before you, a man who was building anything, he said. I was a man who was moving. I had told myself moving and building were the same thing because I could not stay still long enough to know the difference. And then I turned around and came back to a saloon and a woman who gave me back my coin. And everything I have built since then has been because of what I understood about the difference between moving and building when I looked at you, and knew that you were worth coming back to. Frances was quiet for a moment. The sunset moved through its colors. She turned back to look at it. You know what I have never told you, she said. Tell me, he said. When you left the Silver Spur that morning, she said, I watched you from the window. I watched you ride to the end of the street. And when you turned the horse around, she stopped, and for a moment there was in her face the specific expression of a woman revisiting a thing that had mattered enormously at the time. I felt something I had not felt since I was a girl, something like certainty, not about what would happen, about what I wanted to happen. He looked at her. What did you want to happen? She looked back at him. Exactly this, she said. All of exactly this. He reached over and took her hand in his, the same hand he had covered on the table at the church supper the first time, the hand with the blue-stoned ring that had been Mrs. Howell's mother's and was now entirely Frances's and no one else's. She let her fingers close around his, the same way she had that first time, but different, not tentative now, not the first offering, but the settled and entirely certain grip of someone who has been holding on for 9 years and intends to keep going. The sun finished going down. The stars began in the west. The creek moved below them, cold now in September, murmuring over its stones in the dark. Inside the house, Robert made a sound from sleep, not unhappy, just present. Frances turned her head slightly, listening, and when it did not continue, she settled back. He'll sleep, Gilbert said. He will, she agreed. They sat on in the September evening with the land around them that was theirs, and the children inside who were theirs, and the life between them that was theirs in the deepest possible sense. Not owned, not fixed, but built deliberately and daily, from the moment a coin hit a bar and a woman slid it back, and a man looked up from it into a pair of creekwater eyes and could not, in the end, ride away. Thomas grew into a young man who was both scholar and horseman in equal measure, eventually studying law in Topeka and returning to Harlow to practice it, specifically in the areas of land rights and property claims, a choice of specialty that nobody who knew his parents found in the least bit surprising. Clara Louise became the second teacher at the Harlow school, and she had Miss Collins's thoroughness and her mother's directness, and Mr. Holt's capacity for being delighted by a difficult student, and she was generally agreed to be remarkable in the specific way that Frances Graves's children were always, from the beginning, clearly going to be. Robert, who had been born in March when the plains were just remembering how to be green, became a baker. This was not a plan so much as a fact that revealed itself gradually through his childhood and early adulthood, through the years of flour on everything, and the mornings he spent at the Morgan Bakery learning from Agnes and Millicent with a seriousness that suggested the learning was not casual. By 20, he was fully capable of running the kitchen, and he did. And under his management the bakery added items to the menu that his mother had not thought of and kept everything that had made it what it was from the beginning. Frances watched him one morning when she came in early, before the business hours began, and found him at the oven with the focused, unhurried quality she recognized as the quality of someone doing the thing they were born to do. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her coffee in her hand, watching. She thought about a room above a milliner's shop in a town she had passed through. She thought about a coin on a bar, and a man with quiet eyes who had looked at her like a question he actually wanted answered. She thought about $62 and a land deed and creek water, and the smell of new lumber, and the sound of a horse turning around in the dirt at the edge of town. She thought about a life fully made from the rawest possible materials by two people who had decided that the building was worth the effort and that each other was worth the turning back. Robert looked up from the oven and saw her in the doorway and said, "The cinnamon rolls will be ready in 20 minutes. "Good," she said. "Your father will want two." "He always wants two," Robert said. "He always has," she said. She went to the table by the window that looked over the creek and sat down with her coffee and waited. And the morning light came in over the cottonwoods and touched everything in the way that morning light on the Kansas plains had always touched everything, without reservation, generous and indifferent and beautiful. Falling on the bread and the coffee and the woman with the creek water eyes and the life she had built with her own hands from her own vision, and the company of a man who had known enough on a road at the edge of a nothing town in the summer of 1878 to turn his horse around and go back. He came in at 7, as he always did, with the cold of the early morning still on his jacket, his hair gone fully silver now at the temples, his face the face she had known for 15 years, familiar in every particular and still, inexplicably, interesting to her in the way that only truly well-chosen things remain interesting. Not with the electric novelty of the beginning, but with the deeper and more sustaining quality of genuine understanding. The knowledge of another person that has been gathered over years of honest attention. He sat down across from her. He looked at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and pushed his coffee across the table to him. Robert brought the cinnamon rolls. Outside, the creek went on moving over its stones. The cottonwoods stood in the early light. The town of Harlow, Kansas, went about its morning business. And on the table between Frances Morgan Graves and Gilbert Graves, a coffee cup sat where a coin had once been, and the day opened ahead of them in the generous abundance of a life that had been built, with patience and intention and a very great deal of love, into something entirely worth the building.